So I'm going to go ahead and do the basic housekeeping, go ahead and set up my project folder, save my file, all of that good stuff. Hopefully I named the folder properly this time. Named it 3D1 last week. Okay, we're going to start off with a pretty simple question, and that is, what is animation? Okay.
It's making an inanimate object or something you created move and actually come to life.
That's a good answer. Let's boil it down to something a little simpler, though. If we were to boil this down to its base, could we say that animation is change over time? Some sort of property, position, scale, rotation, something like that changes over a set amount of time. You have to have those two things. You have to have change and you have to have a time span to change it over. So that's kind of where we're going to start. Let's make a box right in the middle of the screen. Again, size, all that stuff does not matter at this point. And once we've created the box, we're going to jump over to the 2, 4, 5th icon. The helpers icon looks like a T-square. And we're going to make a dummy. Now, we used dummies a little bit at the end of last semester, I think, when we did our chess sets. But you're just going to make your dummy and then place it at 0, 0, 0, same place that you hopefully put your box. Now, it is important that if you scale your dummy, you do it evenly. You don't scale it more on the X or the Y or the Z than you do the other two axes. It's always important that you keep it square. Where you place it at this point is not a huge deal, just so that it occupies roughly the same space as your box. Now, one of the reasons we're going to do that is, for the most part, we want to separate our animations from our geometry. Yes, Kyler?
The boxes are being funky.
Make them bigger.
Well, that's quick and clean. They're just
Okay.
making rectangles.
I don't know. Because a lot of times if you make it too small, it will just disappear. I would try a different mouse. It seems like we're getting multiple clicks. Yeah, that's what it is. The mouse is fried. I jump over here. Yeah, that involves me removing stuff out of the back, so I don't really want to do that. Okay. So yeah, if something like that happens to you, chances are the mouse is just wearing out. We'll give Kylan just a minute to get up and running again. While we're waiting on that, I'm going to go ahead and just talk about the reason that we want to separate a lot of our animation from our geometry whenever possible. There will be times when we have to animate the geometry directly. If we have a melt modifier on our geometry and we want to animate that melt modifier, then we have to animate the geometry. Does that make sense? But if I'm moving an object or I'm rotating an object, oftentimes it's best to attach it to a dummy. There are other types of helpers as well. Later on in the semester, we'll use a point helper when we do some rigging and things like that. But by separating it, it allows me to make the animation and make it work, and then I can worry about making it pretty. But right now, I could say this is a spaceship. It's not a very good spaceship. It's a Borg spaceship. But later on, I can make it a really fancy Last Starfighter spaceship if I wanted to. It's useful for like when you're making prototypes of things. You don't want to spend forever making the model on something that you may not use. But here you can quickly block out the animation, get it working, and then replace the model when needed. That being said, we need to make the geometry a child of our dummy. And we're going to do that with our select and link tool. So we're going to drag from the geometry and hover over the dummy. Dummy's going to turn yellow, and then we're going to release. Now I always check my linkage and make sure that it works. So I grab my dummy. Both my object and my dummy should move. Another way that I can view this is to use my, man, I've got to change the resolution here. I don't want that. See, I got a bunch of stuff hiding. But anyway, this is the one I'm looking for right here. And this is called my schematic view. Now, it's the 2 lines with the arrow. I don't know how else to describe it. And make your dummy slightly bigger than your object. Okay, with them being almost the same size, Thomas, that's what giving me sense. If you make it bigger, it's easier to work with. But remember, if you scale that dummy, and that's the only way to make it bigger, is to scale it, make sure that you scale uniformly. Okay, so in my schematic view now, I have a nice little view of the parent-child relationship that I have since created. And again, that's the 2 lines, one is white, one is green, has a green arrow pointing downwards on it. I'm sure there's a shortcut key for it. I don't know what it is. Okay. We're going to do a lot with parent-child relationships throughout the semester. For now, I just need you to understand that the dummy is the parent of the geometry. And for the most part, the dummy is going to hold most of the animation for us. Okay, everybody with me? Cool. All right, so I'm going to do a quick review of the tools and some of the options that we have down here in our timeline. So let's get with that. Now this, of course, is my timeline. By default, we have 100 frames. By default, our frame rate runs at 30 frames per second. That's roughly 3 seconds worth of animation. We're going to learn how to add more to our timeline pretty quickly. If I grab the playhead and I move it back and forth like this is called scrubbing the playhead. This is how I can view my animations. If I click on the little arrows, it's going to move 1 frame at a time. We will look at that here in just a minute when we get there. Here we have our isolate button, we have our lock button, we also have our outputs for the X, Y, and Z information. That should be old hat. Next to that, we're going to have our playback buttons. Now we have play, we have previous frame, and then we have go to start, go to end. You'll notice that there's a little toggle, it says key mode toggle when I hover over it. By doing that, that's going to change from previous frame to previous key. So if you want to jump through your animation and jump to the keyframes, very useful when you're doing animations. We've all seen the little clock icon. It looks like a clock. I'm going to click on that. Go ahead and bring that up as well. This is my time configuration window. This is where we can set things such as our frame rate. Like I said, default, it's NTSC. That's roughly 29.9 frames per second, I believe. You can, however, do custom and then do something like 240 frames per second. I think that's as high as you can go, is 240. That's like super slow-mo when you run it back at 30 frames per second. It's a lot of fun. For most of your stuff, though, the NTSC, the default, will work just fine. You can change how it's going to display. Frames, SMPTE, which I'm not exactly 100% sure what that is. Frames and ticks, minutes, seconds, and ticks. I usually just do frames. Now, when you get into some really complex animations, possibly you might need to break it down to minutes, seconds, and ticks. Each tick represents a single frame. As far as playback goes, most of the time you're going to leave it at real time. But something that as animators you will do is you will stare at your animations until you are sick of them, and you will watch them play over and over and over again. Oftentimes playing something back really slow helps you catch any mistakes that you might have noticed, or you may not have noticed. So you play back at 1/4 speed. If you untick real time, you can also play it in reverse. Believe it or not, that's a really good way to catch mistakes in your animation as well. Watch something play back in reverse. I'm going to go ahead and re-tick real time, make it go forward. Below that, where it says animation, there are two things that you need to know here. Number one, this is where we add extra frames. I'm going to ask for about 10 seconds every week. That's 300 frames. So by changing the length to 300 and hitting enter, you will notice that my timeline has changed down below. The rescale time, if I click on the rescale time item, this gives me the option to rescale keys as well. So if I made my animation 300 frames or 10 seconds long, and my client comes to me and says, that looks great, except it's way too fast, can you go ahead and make it 20 seconds long? I can come down here, I can redo my length to 600 frames. I hit OK, and if I had any keyframes down here, it would move them proportionately. So I'm doubling it, so if I had 15 frames between each keyframe, I would then end up with 30 frames between each keyframe. And as you're playing today, after I get done with the lecture, you ought to check into that and see how that works for you. I'm going to go ahead and cancel it because I don't want to rescale my time at this point. 300 frames is plenty for me. All right, so we're going to hit OK. Next to that, we have the big add key symbol, auto key, set key. We also have our tangents. Now, before we start making any animation, your tangents is the little icon that says default in and out tangents when you hover over it. Mine currently looks like a Bezier handle. Yours might look slightly different. If you click and hold on that, we're going to see we have several options. I want you to pick the one that looks like a straight line. Okay, so yeah, if you need to pop your head over the monitor to kind of see, I apologize, it is down low. Now, a tangent, you may or may not remember, we touched on them just briefly last semester, but if I have two keyframes, Max has to figure out how it's going to fill in all of those frames in between it. In traditional animation, this is referred to as easing. You ease in or you ease out of an animation. Sometimes you'll hear it called slowing in or slowing out. Same thing. Right now, since we have set it to linear, everything is going to move at exactly the same speed. There'll be no speeding up, there'll be no slowing down at the beginning or the end of the animation. Now we're going to do an experiment here with these in just a minute, and I'm going to show you how much of an effect easing can have on your animation. I usually start off with linear tangents to begin with, and then I'll go back in and I will change them as needed. Linear is good though because it just gives you a nice constant movement from beginning to end. Auto key and set key. Auto key, any changes that I make with the playhead down here at frame 135 will be automatically recorded. It will, by default, put a frame at frame 0 for me. So any animation I create will start at frame 0 and go to frame 135. If I want my animation to begin at frame 100, the easiest way is to put my playhead at frame 100 and hit the big key. That's going to create a keyframe there. That way there'll be no change from 0 to 100, and then from 1 to 135 or 140, whatever I've selected, that will be when the animation takes place. Think back to when you did your chess pieces. You had to manually add those keyframes so that not all the pieces started to move at frame 0, right? Okay, same idea. That's auto key. Automatically records whatever you do at the place that the playhead is sitting. Set key. Set key functions a little differently than auto key. To record anything, I have to make my changes and then come down here and hit the set key or press the K key on my keyboard. One thing to note, set key will only record what I have told it to. So there's a key down there called filters, a little pop-up button called filters. If you click that, now I can say, well, I want you to record position and scale only. I want to record just the object parameters, height, width, depth. I want to record only the modifiers. Any changes I make to modifiers will be stored at this point in time. Whichever one you use is completely up to you. I don't think that either one of them is better than the other. It's just whatever you're comfortable using. 9 times out of 10, especially for demos in class, you will see me use auto key. Think of it like autopilot. I make changes, it automatically records them for me. All right, sweet. All right, so that's it for our review. Now we're going to look at a few things real quick before we move on too much. So, I'm going to create a very simple animation. It's going to start at frame 0. I'm going to use auto key, and I'm going to go to about frame 100. And I'm just going to move it on the Y or the Z axis, really doesn't matter which one. But make sure that you are moving the dummy and not your geometry. So we just want a simple little animation of our object moving. When you're done, make sure you turn off auto key. Don't want to be recording stuff unknowingly. Now if I double click on the parent, I'm going to select all of the children for that parent. If I have everything selected and I do shift drag, I'm going to make copies. And I want to make, we'll make 2 copies. Okay. Now, is everybody comfortable with the idea of the copy, instance, and reference and what the difference is between those? If not, I'd be happy to go over. Okay, thank you, Jimmy. Okay, a copy has all of the current properties of the object I'm copying, but if I make changes to either the original or the copy, it only affects the one I made the changes to. An instance is basically the same object as the original. Any changes that I make to the instance filter out to all of the instances. So if I have a box that's 10 by 10 by 10 and I make 20 copies of it, and I'm sorry, I make 20 instances of it and I change the dimensions, all 20 of my boxes will change. That's an instance. Now a reference allows me to have some properties in common with the original, but then I can add things to the copy that do not apply to the original. This might be something that you want to research a little more. It does take a little bit of rolling around in your head, but it's useful to know the difference. If you're making a stadium for somebody, you want to make sure that all of those chairs in the stadium are instances, just in case you need to resize them. Okay, so, but for us, we want copies because we're going to be changing things, so we want them to all be unique. If I were to scrub my playhead, we can see that we have the world's most boring animation. Okay, you should have 3 boxes at this point. If you don't, I will give you a minute to go ahead and make that copy. But please make sure you turn off auto key before you go and make your copies. Not quite sure what that would do. Double click on it and grab the parent and the child.
I know what it does.
I once discovered that if you have auto key on and you make an array, it will animate that array being made, which is kind of cool. Wasn't the effect I was going for, but yeah, you find out lots of mistakes, and some of them are good. Okay, everybody got our cubes? Looks like everybody pretty much does. If not, or you're having trouble, don't hesitate to ask, guys. That's what I'm here for. Okay, we're going to look at what is called our curve editor next. Now, there's two of these actually. If you look at your toolbar or you look at your timeline, there's the mini curve editor, which kind of pops up down here, and it's useful. It does everything that the curve editor does. Click on the close button to close it. Or we have the big curve editor, which floats free and gets in the way of most things. This takes some getting used to. So the curve editor is up here at the top. It's got a curve on it. Now when we talk about the curve editor, what we are talking about is how the computer interpolates or creates the actual animation. Everything is color coded, so I don't know if you did X or Y. Hopefully you did one of those two. X would be the red line, Y would be the green line. As I select the object, dummy 1, then I have different options for that object. In this case, transform, rotation, and scale. Those are the only three that I currently have. If I had modifiers applied to my object, then it would say modified object, and I could access those properties as well. But for our demonstration, I'm just going to select the Y position because that's the one that I changed. Now to move around in this viewport, middle mouse button is your pan. Alt Control middle mouse button and either left to right will zoom you in or zoom you out on the, we'll call it the horizontal. And then up and down will zoom you in or out, going up and down, and that's with Control and Alt clicked. That really takes some getting used to. Okay, so everybody see the line? If you don't, please tell me. Yes. Okay, no problem. Could be a couple of different things. Let's go ahead and start by selecting just one. Okay. So chances you were just way off in the distance. Okay. Cool. Yes.
Can I, how did you get that?
Make it bigger?
Yeah.
The dock itself?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
I accidentally dragged it up.
Anytime, it's gonna be these dots,
Right.
and then we'll just pull and you can make it fit around. And then drag it down, it's kind of a pain.
Yeah, and then my line will show as well.
Okay, that's because, you had your dot selected,
Oh.
the draw animation on the dot. Right, you need the dummy selected.
Sounds good.
All right? Okay. Okay, we should auto key, select the object. Okay. Now all I'm doing is scrubbing the playhead to see the animation. Well, you don't have to. You would change over time. We're changing the position. This is the time in which we're changing it. Okay. Now, as far as the copy goes, I'm just going to shift drag. Okay. Select one of these. Now we moved it on the y-axis, which is the red. So position, X position. There is your animation. Okay. All right. Everybody else? Okay. Very good. Now, Up and down is the value of which it's moving. Okay, so it goes from 0 to, mine goes to approximately, if I click on it, it'll tell me exactly what it is. 66.6. So that's 66.6 units in 3D space. The numbers across the bottom represent the frames. So if I were to say this in the simplest terms, the numbers going up and down are the change. That could be scale, rotation, brightness, transparency, any of these things that you can change. And then across the bottom would be the time in which those changes occur. Each of these little squares represents one of my keyframes. Notice how when I select one of these squares, the corresponding keyframe on my timeline highlights. And I can drag a box over to select, or if I'm feeling particularly, dexterous, I can click right on it. I find it a lot easier oftentimes to just drag the box. Does that make sense? Because those are really small. But again, I want you to note the correlation between what you're seeing in the curve editor with what you're seeing on the timeline. So this is our linear interpolation. And we can see that because it's a straight line. Let's go ahead and select the next dummy in our line. Let's find that same curve. In this case, it's going to be the Y curve for me. Now I can drag and select that. Up here we have some quick tools, I guess a good way to call them. I can set my tangents to auto. If I do that, that's going to give me a Bezier handle, and then I can go crazy with my tangents. I can set my tangents to spline, which is a lot like auto, but it gives you a little bit more control. Now here we have the two basics. We have set tangents to fast and set tangents to slow. I'm going to go ahead and set this tangent to fast. That means it is going to ramp up as it goes through the animation. I could highlight both of these and do them both at the same time if I wanted, or I could do them individually. And there's lots of ways to do this. Now I do need to mention this as well. I want you to select one of your tangents and then right click on it. I'm sorry, so one of your keyframes and then right click on it. Notice how it says in and out. What's up? Oh, did you get stuck?
Yep.
Grab these dotted lines right there, and that's going to let you pull it off. Okay. Notice it says in and out. Tangents in is anything that is on the left side of the keyframe. Tangents out are anything on the right side of particular keyframe. So I could set this to ease in and ease out at the same time, or make them manual, or all kinds of crazy things. I just want you to understand the idea of easing. This is not going to be, this is how you do everything, obviously. Okay, so we're going to leave that one, and let's go to the third one now. And on this one, you can do pretty much anything you want to the tangents. Okay, I'm going to set mine to auto, and I'm just going to go crazy with them. So I have a nice swooping S shape now. Now the purpose of this, we're going to go back to our, once we're done playing, we're going to go back to our main viewport, and I want to show you something. I have 100 frames worth of animation, right? 0 to 100, that's where I put my keyframes. Now if I run this, I have to sit through 200 frames of nothing because I have nothing after the 100th frame. But on my timeline, everybody watch this, this is great. I'm going to press Alt and Control, and if I left click and drag, I'm going to move the starting point. So instead of starting at 0, I would now start at -60 frames. I'm going to put that back at 0. Because what I want to do is I want to left click, and I'm going to drag it out so that frame 100 is my last frame. That's the exact same thing as if I went to the time configuration window and changed it here. So practice that real quick. It's Alt and Control together. Right click is going to move the end marker. Left clicking will move the beginning marker. If you create an animation that it's snowing in your world, oftentimes you will start your particles at -100. That way when you reach frame 0, you've already got your particles in full swing. And we'll talk about that as we go. But let's go ahead and hit play on this now and just kind of look what happens to my animations. They are really slow, much slower than I thought they would be. I thought I moved them farther than that. So this is the one that moves at a constant speed. This one eases in and out, so it ramps up and then kind of slows down towards the end. And then finally, this is the one that I went crazy on. All three of those have the exact same keyframes, but we end up with 3 very different animations because of our tangents, because of what we've done to them. Now, easing is a great way to add impact to your animations. If you drop something, it needs to accelerate as it falls towards the ground. We did that with the bouncing ball. When it gets to the top of the arc, it needs to hover for just, 1/10 of a second, and then it falls. And as it falls, it picks up speed. When it leaves the ground, it has all that pent-up energy, and it leaves very quickly, and it bounces real high, hopefully. And that is all done through easing. Okay, yes? Okay, that's because there is no change on the z-axis. Okay, it's a perfectly straight line. Select simply the x-axis. Now do it. There was nothing to change. So go ahead and click on, and now it's grooved. Okay. Okay. Now I got a room full of you guys, so you got to know which frame or which axis you're animating on. You guys got, because you're all going to do it different. Yes, David. Okay, so like if you wanted to, we go ahead and close this. Going to highlight that. This would be set tangents to fast, set tangents to slow. And again, this would basically be easing in. Perfect. And then we'll set that to easing out. So notice how it kind of ramps up and then it evens out. And the best way to do this is just to get in there and tinker with it. And then see what happens. Does that make sense? Okay. With this will make your animations have much more impact. Not very many things move at a constant speed from start to finish. All right, let's go ahead and stop that wonderful animation. All right, I'm going to talk for 10 more minutes and then we'll take a quick break at 9 o'clock. But the next thing I want to talk about is animation controllers. Now, when we talk about animation controllers, there are some default things, such as when let's move these guys out of the way. So I'm just going to drag a box over all of them and just move them over. The nice thing about doing that, of course, is it took all the animations with them. I'm going to grab my original one and make a copy of it to work with. Now, if I've added animations to an object, it's a simple matter of going to my timeline, highlighting them till they turn white, and hitting the delete key. So let's go ahead and remove the animation from the copy we just made. Okay, when I go to move this, it is being controlled by a animation controller. When I go to rotate it, same thing, as well as scale. These are all different animation controllers. We're going to take the dummy, just the dummy, and let's open up our curve editor again. Come on, Mr. Curve Editor. Oh, there it is, okay. Now I have no changes here, that's why all my lines are flat. There's no animation. But I'm going to select the Z position, right click on it, and this is going to open up all kinds of options for me. There's a lot of cool stuff here. For us right now, we're looking for where it says Assign Controller. Everybody should be in your curve editor. These are all different controllers that we can add to our object, or we can use to control the shape, what our object does. I'm going to stay up there. Kind of hard to record myself if I'm out walking around the room. By default, this is called a Bezier float. We can, however, change it to an audio float. That means I could feed a piece of music into this, and during the really loud parts, my box is going to move up and down a whole bunch. During the really soft parts, my box is going to move just a tiny little bit. Okay. Now they are very, very picky about what you can bring in. Last time I tried to do it live in class, it was bad. It just did not like my audio file. After I'm done today, I may do it just to see if I can get it to work. But we have something similar that we can do, and that would be a noise float. Whenever you hear the term noise, that always means the same thing. Think static. Anytime you add noise to a picture or you add noise to a texture, it's going to rough it up, right? Same thing here. So I want us all to select noise float and hit OK. That's going to bring up this little dialog box. Now we need to take that strength and we need to put it at about 100. When we do that, look what happens to your Z axis, the animation. It should have done what mine did, hopefully. If not, increase that number, make that strength even more. So if I play my animation now, and Autodesk crashed. That is unfortunate. Good thing we're close to a break. Okay, so now I've got my bouncing box, right? But watch what happens. I can move, no, actually I can't. Yes, I can. I can move it on the X and the Y axis. But I can no longer move it up and down because I have taken away the XYZ, the Bezier float, and I have replaced it with that noise controller. Now to fix this, if you wanted to fix it, it's a simple matter. Coming back here, right-clicking on that, assigning controller, and always pay attention to what the default is before you change it. Word to the wise. Bezier float. By doing so, I have erased my animation that I created, but now I can move it up and down manually again. That makes sense? And you can do some really, really cool stuff with this. Like I said, between the noise floats, as well as the audio stuff. The audio stuff's a lot of fun. You could build yourself a really cool graphic equalizer in 3ds Max. All right, with that, I think we will call a break real quick. The next two topics I'm going to go through fairly quickly. Again, there's a lot more to talk about with controllers, but now you have a basic idea, you have a basic understanding that everything is controlled by some sort of controller, and there are controllers that are beyond your imagination at this point, and that's what you need to know at this point. If I try to teach you everything, number one, I don't know it. Number two, you would forget most of it. understand that there are controllers. And while you're thinking of your animation, I'm going to blow this building up. Well, I'm going to add a noise controller to the rotation of the pieces as they fly away. That way, when I make that piece of rubble fly through the air, it's turning in a really random, organic way. Does that make sense? Makes sense to me. All right, break time. Go get some coffee. So the next thing we're going to look at is called animation constraints. By their very name, we should kind of understand what it's going to do. We all understand what the word constraint means, correct? To bind or to restrict in some way. Well, these animation constraints are going to help us an awful lot. So again, we're going to keep working with the same pieces that we had before, simple. We're not too concerned about what it looks like at this point. Now, one thing that I will ask is that you go ahead and start with a fresh one that has no animation on it at all. So make yourself a copy, make sure that all of your default controllers are returned so that you have, you can XYZ it and all of that good stuff. Now, when we work with constraints, they're going to make our life as animators a little easier. They're going to help us do some basic things. We can find the majority of them, and the ones I'm going to go over underneath animation, and then the word constraints. You can find everything you need to know about animation underneath the animation flyout across the top. So everybody go ahead and click on where it says animation and then constraints.
How do you remove a controller?
You add the new one, and so you're just going to go Bezier float. And make sure that that's right. Hit back. And now make sure you can move it around. So go ahead and make sure you grab it. Okay, now. Let's make sure that we are dealing with the right object. So I got the dummy position. Okay. You actually, I think, had your geometry slip when you changed that. So assign controller, we go back to that VA flow. Okay. So these are the basic ones, and these are I'm only going to show you like 3 of these. And then the help file is rather helpful on these particular subjects. I expect you to spend some time going over that as well. Number 1, let's go ahead and look at the path constraint. Now, let's not click on that yet because I have to create the path first. So if you have clicked on it, that's fine. Just go ahead and right click. But by the name, hopefully we can start to puzzle out what this thing's going to do for us. It's going to constrain the movement of my object to a path that I create. That's great, especially if you want to do like a fly-through of your level, or you want to do a dogfight scene between a couple of spaceships or something like that. You don't want to manually animate those things doing loop-de-loops. You want to create a curve, throw it on that path, and go follow that path. So that's what we're going to learn how to do. All right, so a path, you may remember, hopefully, is going to be a fancy word for a line. So we're going to go to Create, Shapes, which is the second option after Geometry. And we're just going to start with a simple line. Now you could use the circle or the arc or just about any of these shapes, but the line's going to be what we use. So I'm simply going to click, and I'm clicking and releasing. That way I'm creating perfectly straight lines. I'm going to add some curve to that in a minute, but I'm going to do it when I'm done. And so now I've right-clicked to get out of creation mode. If I want to edit my line, this is the way I generally do it. I will start off with perfectly straight lines. I go into my vertex selection mode for my line object, and I'm going to scroll down here until I see a button that says fillet or fillet. I'm not sure which one it is. I generally say fillet, F-I-L-L-E-T. So I'm going to select this, and then that's going to let me curve that off a little bit. And then if I wanted to, there are other tools here I could use as well. I could insert some points, so I could insert a point there if I wanted to, and so on. So now that I have my path, I'm going to take my dummy. Make sure it's my dummy that I have selected. Go to Animation, Constraints, and Path Constraint. Now I'm going to get a little rubber band that attaches my cursor to the dummy. It won't let me select on the incorrect object. I cannot use a box as a path constraint. It's not a path. Max will only let me click on the appropriate object. It'll highlight yellow. I'm going to click on that. If you did it right, your object should move from its current position to the box or to the path. You will notice that it has created a keyframe at the very beginning at frame 0, as well as at the end of your timeline. And that's how long it's going to take for you to traverse your path. Again, if you need to move these, simply highlight the one you want to move and move it. When it comes to keyframes, just manhandle them around. Now we have some options that bear mentioning here. Number one, notice how as I scrub my playhead, my box doesn't really follow the path. I mean, it goes where the path leads, but it doesn't orient itself to the path. It simply stays in the position that it's in. Let's go to our, let me find it real quick, just make sure I'm going to the right place. Okay, so we're going to go to our 4th tab over in the command panel, and it's the one that says motion when you hover over it. Because that's what we're dealing with, motion. I'm going to go ahead and drag this out so I can see a few more of my windows. There we go, that's better. We're going to go down to where it says path parameters. Underneath the path parameters, we have things like follow. If I click on follow, you will now notice that the box orients itself to the path. Now sometimes they do funky things like right here. Okay, I am by no means the master of the path. So if yours does funky things, maybe rethink your path. But this would be great if I had a couple of cars that I wanted to race. Because then my car would orient itself to the path. If I'm flying, then I might want to consider banking. Notice how when I come around the corner now, it rotates and it banks. We got any Roller Coaster Tycoon fans here? I used to play the crap out of that game. It took me forever to realize the reason nobody will ride your roller coasters, John, is because the corners don't bank. And they would just like, the G-forces would be unbelievable when they would hit those corners. Nobody wants to ride that, okay?
People panicking.
Yeah. Yeah, creative ways to kill your Sims.
Panicking.
Okay, so banking is cool. Now you want to be careful with the banking amount and so on. If you allow upside down, your object will go upside down if it needs to. You can change things like the constant velocity. You can change whether it speeds up or slows down. The coolest thing I like about this, though, yes?
I don't have the path.
Okay, hang on one second. We will find out why. Okay, so what do you have? Actually, I'm going to do that.
It's because you have so
Okay, I don't think you want to connect. Okay, so grab this, go to animation, go to path constraint, and then click on your path. Okay, now, so you just weren't connected, okay?
I have the same issue.
Okay, you're probably just not connected to your path. There you go, look at that. Okay, now you're connected. And so you're gonna have to scroll down your path.
Okay.
So there's your options for that.
Well,
Yes.
the box doesn't move with my dummy, but it'll like rotate with it.
Let me see. You're good. You're good. And always check your fire.
Check this out of the back.
So, yeah.
It's because I was moving stressing.
This along the path? Yeah, so what that
It
does,
just like spasses out of the
oh, yeah, then both connected to the path. This is no longer a child of that. Okay, so the way we would fix that would be to grab this guy. No, have it child rather.
I think you go, I believe. And that'll be a lot of.
No, I don't think deleting it would work, honestly.
I was trying to figure out on my own.
Okay, so in this case, let's do this.
Spasm.
Did you change the blue maybe that would help, making them smaller.
I actually didn't touch that.
So we'll,
Oh, you did, okay.
yeah, right underneath it, just see if it like, just slow enough.
Bring it up.
It's constantly spinning. It's just constantly.
You're good. What happened was you had them both attached to the path. I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
Okay.
So on this kind of thing, like, is there a way to make your line go like vertical, or then it would like?
I can grab my line and I can move it just as I would any other object.
I just did it with courtesies.
Yeah, but like if you're going on a roller coaster, so
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, that's, I understand your question. So yes, absolutely. So come into your sub-selection mode, go to vertex. Let me grab these three vertices,
And then just bring them up.
drag them upwards.
Okay.
So I just did that.
Let's grab this guy, drag him downwards. Yes, absolutely. Now, this builds on stuff that we, touched on in the first one. Okay, so when we talk about the lines, vertex, segment, spline, that should be, you should at least know those terms.
Yeah.
Okay, this is, this class, I assume that you are good to go. So, yeah, if you want to change your path, absolutely, go in and change your path. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But, okay. So one of the cool things I like about this now is you can have more than one path. Okay, so let's say, for instance, I'm going to make a copy of this. We're going to bring it up here. I'm going to grab my dummy. And again, it's really important that you're paying attention to what you're grabbing and you're grabbing the correct object. If I were to grab the geometry, this would not work. But I'm going to grab the dummy. I'm going to go to my motion path. And I'm going to say add path. So now, when I added the new path, you will notice in my path parameters, I have line 1, line 2. They both have a weight of 50%. Look at where my object is. Halfway between path 1 and path 2. If I increase the weight of line 2, path 2, and I decrease the weight of line 1, then it goes all the way to path 2. How is this useful? You got two cars that are going down the road following a path. You want one of the cars to pass the other car. Make them change lanes. Okay, path A is the slow lane, path 1 is the slow lane, path 2 is the passing lane. Increase the weight. Now again, this is not something that you're going to get right off the bat. You need to go play with this. You need to look it up on the 3ds Max help file. You need to play with it. You need to break it a few times.
So did you just put that path in order to make that?
Correct.
One, or did you clone it?
I cloned the first one and then I said add path. I had to have a path to add the path. So yes, I just simply made a copy. It could be a completely new path. But this is a great little tool, such as people have said already, roller coaster or a dogfight scene or just about anything you can imagine that you need something to follow a preordained path on. Later on, we'll learn how to attach particles to this thing so it spits out particles as it follows the path. Okay, so that is one of our animation constraints that I find quite useful and I use all the time, especially handy for cameras. Because then you can just kind of path your way through your scene and have your camera follow along and look at this for a little bit, and then it turns and it looks at something else, and so on, and it gives you a way to show off your work. All right, we're going to move these out of the way. So real quick, all I need to do is highlight both of the paths and drag them out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and make another copy of my box. So again, I'm double clicking and that selects all of the children. Shift drag to make a copy. And then we will look at our next constraint that we're going to look at today. I'm going to need 2 copies for this particular one. So, because I'm going to do what is called a look at this time. This is really useful. We're going to make this object look at this object. Simple as that. So again, I'm attaching my animation to my dummies, so later on I can change my actual model. But I'm going to go to animation with my dummy selected. I go to animation, constraints, and in this case I'm going to do the look at constraint. Simple as that. Now your object may get funky and it may rotate in a direction that you're not quite sure. Make sure I would go ahead and look at the dummy on the second object. But now no matter where I move this to, this object will look at it. So when you're making that epic World War II dogfight scene, you could do some animation where you've got the gunner on the ground and he's tracking the airplane, and then you shoot. You could have your bullet follow a path so it goes directly to the enemy. In real life, of course, you would lead the enemy a little bit, but that's neither here nor there. So that's the look at. Pretty useful if you want an object to be the center of attention for your camera. You could set it up so that your camera always looks at a particular object in your scene. Any questions about that one? Pretty straightforward. Okay. Let's get these out of the way. I'm debating. I'm going to let you explore the other ones by yourselves. One that I think you will find especially useful and especially powerful is called the link constraint. Okay. Oftentimes we talk a lot about the parent-child relationships. Sometimes you need to switch the parent of an object, and a link constraint will allow you to do that. They spell it out really, really well in the help file. So I've showed you path constraint and I've showed you look at, but there's also a surfing constraint, an attachment constraint, a position, an orientation, and then the most useful one of all, the link constraint. But again, I want you to be invested in your own learning, and so I want you to spend some time and go read the help files. Because I know some of you want to stay here at Butler forever, but you can't. You have to graduate, you have to move on. When you get out in the real world, you're not gonna, I mean, if you're lucky, you'll have a mentor where you go to work. You'll have somebody above you going, this is the way we do things around here. More often than not, though, you won't. And you'll be expected to be able to teach yourself. Those help files, once you dig into them, they're extremely helpful. They're pretty well written. All right, so the last demonstration of the day is wire parameters. Now this is a huge, huge can of worms. I'm going to show you something very, very simple. We're going to make it work. We're going to make it happen. And then those of you that are, how many consider yourselves to be scripters or programmers of any sort? Awesome, you're gonna love this. Okay, this is called MaxScript. MaxScript is the internal scripting language used by 3ds Max to make things work. Not only can you script things here so that you could create objects programmatically, but you can animate them programmatically. You can also create tools that other people can use inside of 3ds Max using MaxScript. That being said, I am not the master of MaxScript by any means. Okay. It took me, and again, I teach this every semester. I sat in my office and did it wrong yesterday like 5 times before it occurred to me, oh, I don't need the -1, I just need negative. Okay, we're gonna make gears. Everybody loves gears. There's a new Gears of War coming out. I don't know if anybody plays that particular game, but I remember playing like the second one a really long time ago. Okay, so we can clear off our work area. We're going to go to a top-down view, and I'm going to show you how to make a gear in 15 seconds or less. We're going to create a cylinder. Again, size really doesn't matter. I'm going to press F4 to go ahead and bring up my edged faces. I see this a lot, guys. I do not need that much geometry going top to bottom. That's an easy fix. Simply go to height segments and click on 1. Right click it, it goes down to 1, lowest possible value. Now, I say that because I want you guys to get in the habit of using the least amount of geometry that you can to accomplish your goal. So it'd be height segments, and then you can just put in 1. Awesome. Okay. Either way, either add edit poly modifier or convert that object to an editable poly, whichever one you prefer. The only difference is if you convert it, it's permanent. If you add the edit poly modifier, you could remove that modifier later on if you want to. I go back and forth. I do it both ways.
What's the benefit of being able to remove it?
Just in case you change your mind or you break something.
Okay.
Because I get in here and I start modeling now, all of those changes are permanent. There's no going back to the cylinder. If I get in here and I've added the edit poly and I break it really bad, I can go back to my cylinder. So it's more of it's like a safety net is a good way to put it. And like I said, depending on what I'm doing, if it's something I know how to do, then I will convert to an editable poly. If it's something brand spanking new I've never done, I'll use the modifier. So gives you that I can go back to this point if I need to. Okay, so I'm going to go into polygon selection mode, and I'm just going to go around and select, holding control, I'm going to select every other face going around my object. Not Windows key. Okay, so it should look like that. We're going to make our gear by extruding our faces. Now this is a good example. That's not at all what I wanted to happen, right? So again, I'm going to click and I want to say we're going to expand from local normal. Ooh, and I know what happened. I've selected the bottom. So let's go ahead and deselect that with Alt. That's what I want right there. I don't think I'm going to go out 10 though. I think we'll just do smaller. Okay. So there's a 30-second gear. Go ahead and extrude them out. If they don't look like the way you want them to, remember, change whether you're doing local normal or by polygon or whatever the other option is. I don't remember off the top of my head. I just looked at it, but I don't remember what it was. So there's my gear. Pretty straightforward. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of my sub-selection mode. So I can do that by just clicking on the word editable poly. Now before I animate with this, what do I need to do? What would be good practice? I'm going to make a dummy. And again, I'm working at 0, 0, 0. That just makes everything so much easier. And so now I'm going to put that right in the middle. And I am going to attach my geometry to my dummy. And then I like to check my linkage, make sure everything's working. So really quick, I'm going to add some rotation to my gear. So auto key, move my playhead down here to about frame 100. Hit E to rotate. Make sure that my angle snapping is turned on up here at the top. And I'm going to rotate that 360 degrees. Turn off my auto key when I'm done. And that's a nice slow turn, not too fast. I went out to 100 frames. So it takes about 3 seconds for it to rotate all the way around. Does everybody have that? Okay, looks good. I love 200 level classes. All right. So let's double click on our dummy to select the parent and the child. I'm going to go to my move tool, and I'm simply going to move this up and kind of put it in place where it should be, and I'm going to make it a copy. Now remember, if you grab just the dummy and try to shift drag it or clone it, it's only going to clone the dummy. And we want to make sure we're cloning the gear as well. If I hit play, we can see right off the bat we have a problem. That is not the way gears function. But that's easy to fix. First things first, we need to remove our animation from the second dummy. Select that dummy, go to your timeline, highlight those keyframes, and press delete. Okay, if you get a little behind, don't sweat it. You can go back and rewatch this part of the video. Okay, so now we have a little problem. Only one of my gears moves. That's where our wire parameters come in handy. I am going to take the rotational parameter of this dummy, and I'm going to tie it to this dummy so that when this one turns left, the other one turns right. Everybody watch what I do. This is pretty easy, but it is easy to miss. So with my first dummy selected that has the animation on it, I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to wire parameters. That's going to be at the very bottom of my quad menu that pops up when I right click. It's going to ask me what do I want to retire, what do I want to wire? Well, currently I have transform options, rotation, Z rotation. What do I want to wire it to? Well, I want to wire it to this dummy. Transform, rotation, Z rotation. And you'll get this lovely box right here. Now, this works for lots of different things, so maybe you should experiment after class or during the last hour of class, just kind of see what you can do with this. See how you could tie scale of one object to the scale of another object and so on. But this dummy 07 is our first dummy. Dummy 08 is the second dummy in the wiring parameters. We have some options that we have to choose. Is this a two-way street? Does dummy 8 affect dummy 7 and vice versa? Or, in our case, we're going to go dummy 7 affects dummy 8, so it's a one-way street. So direction of control there. We're going to go ahead and hit connect, but we're not quite there yet, because if I test this, we still have the same problem we had before. They're both basically turned in the same direction. This is where the scripting language itself comes in handy. What do I want it to do? I want it to go in the opposite direction. How do you express that in math? What is the opposite of 5? Negative 5. So let's put a negative symbol in front of Z rotation. And then we'll say update. Now, as one turns left, the other turns right. Now, this can get very, very powerful, and those of you that are scripters will very quickly outpace me on what I can do with wire parameters. And that's what I hope for, honestly. Because I might see what some of y'all do and go, hey, why don't you show me how you did that? But this is a great way for you to tie the position of an object to the position of another object. Or like I said, scale, maybe scale versus rotation, and so on. There's all kinds of things that you can do with these different wire parameters. If you can make the gears function, and you can throw that into your animation this week, I'm pretty happy. You guys got to remember, your skill level is just above beginner. I wouldn't even rank most of you as intermediate yet, and I don't mean that as an insult. By the time you finish this class and you do everything I ask, then I will rank you as an intermediate user of this program. You still have a long ways to go. I still have a long ways to go. I learn new stuff every single semester. I learn better ways of doing things every single semester. But I hope you enjoy that. Yes?
Now nothing's moving.
So let's look at our okay, so I'm not sure why, but there's no change. So what I need to start over. That makes sense? I mean, that would probably be the easiest thing to do. You could sit there and fight with it and try to fix it. Chances are it'd be quicker just to scrap it and start over. That's a lesson some of you really need to learn. There is no shame in starting over. I would rather you start over and work your way through it 3 or 4 times, because by that 5th time, guess what? You got it. You understand it at that point. Rather than get mad, email me the day before it's due and say, this isn't working. I've been trying to fix it for 4 days. Well, that was your mistake. Don't try to fix it for 4 days.
Well, the connection was fine.
Okay, awesome. So there's all kinds of things, but that's something that as students y'all really need to learn. Okay, so here's our recap. We talked about animation concepts and methods. We talked about what is animation, how to use a dummy, how to link our children to the parents. We talked about scrubbing our playhead, zooming in and out. We talked about playhead controls. We talked about how to add more time to our frame rate. There will be no 3-second animation submitted in this class. If I ask for 10 seconds, give me 10 seconds. Okay. Now, if rendering is an issue, you go home and your machine is like, yeah, I'll render that, but it's going to take me about 4.5 minutes a frame. You know, you're looking at 120 hours to render that 10 seconds. Make your video smaller. Okay, just make your video smaller. It's okay. HD is nice, but if you got to render it 800 by 600 or 1280 by 720, and 1280 by 720, guys, is a full 25% smaller than 1920 by 1080, that cuts your render time by 25%. Okay, I'm so old, 1280 by 720 looks fine to me. Yes.
In terms of render quality, what's the minimum you're looking for?
That's variable, depends on what it is. So, you know, I want it to look good, and I want it to be recognizable.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got a lot of noise, come talk to me, and we can fix that.
By chance, would we be able to snag a couple of these computers, let's say, over
Absolutely.
the weekend?
Absolutely, come down. There's no classes on Friday. Brian Foster here is here doing office hours pretty much all day Friday. Okay? I'm not really here, but I might pop in occasionally. But yeah, I'm sure if Brian is here, you guys stop by his office, say, Mr. Foster, could you please let me in the lab? I have to do, 120 hours worth of rendering for Mr. Simpson, and I need 10 machines. And he'd be like, okay, go for it. Guess what? Your 120 hours is now down to 4 hours of render time because you've got 15 machines doing it. So I do a lot of that type of rendering. We used to have a render farm, which is machines all lined up and supposed to render real nice, but
What happened to that?
keeping it running was more trouble than it was worth. It was difficult. And then unfortunately the kid who really understood it quit. So, okay, so we talked about auto key, we talked about set key, we talked about tangents. I have linked to each of these in the assignment page, so let's go over that real quick. So of course modules, 3ds Max animation. Your assignment is due September 2nd, that is 6 days from now. After we take our little break, I will try to get the audio animation thing working for you. I'm just not going to do that on film. But I'm pretty sure this one works. So if you need help, here is a direct link to the help file. Here is the pages for each of the topics we covered today. Again, as future developers, future game makers, future whatever it is you want to be, and the number one thing I can teach you is how to teach yourself. Because nobody's going to hand it to you. YouTube's great, but there's very little substitute for just sitting down and reading the documentation. You may not understand all of it, you may not understand any of it the first couple times you go through it. After a while, it starts to make sense. The more you learn, the easier it is to learn. Okay, so the objective for this course, or for this particular project, is for you to deepen and demonstrate your understanding of animation in 3ds Max. I hope you feel like the last roughly 2 hours have been a good use of your time. I feel like this lecture was pretty much on point. Okay, so you will demonstrate what you have learned by recording yourself creating a short animation using a minimum of 3 of the techniques discussed this week. So when I say a minimum of 3 of the topics, throw in a wire parameter, throw in a constraint, show me that you're gonna render it out at 240 frames per second and then make it into super slow-mo when you run it in through Premiere and you export it out at 30 frames per second. What you guys did last week was really good. I think overall it was mostly A's, a couple B's, and a C. And then 3 of you still owe me something. So make sure you get it turned in. You have 6 more days to do that. A couple of critiques that I do have. Make sure you're showing a little bit of everything you did. Do not focus on just the modeling. Do not focus on just the animation. You have 3.5 minutes. If you split it up, you can show me 20 seconds of each. Show me a little texturing. Show me that you're using the right textures with the right render engine. Okay. Show me that you naming stuff. That's something all of y'all are really bad about. Cylinder 472. That is not useful, man. Okay, when you go work with other people, they're going to expect you to name your objects logically. When you're part of a team, leaving stuff at the default names won't work because nobody will know what it is. I had a friend of mine who bought a template for Adobe Flash years ago. He opens it up, it's layers 1 through 500. They're just layer 1, layer 2, no descriptions at all about what is on these layers. Okay? Absolutely ridiculous. He could have built the thing himself easier than trying to figure out how to use this guy's template.
How much did he waste on it?
It was actually client's money, so it probably wasn't that bad. The client insisted, said, this is what I want, so my friend who's a developer said, okay, we can do that, but it turned out to be more trouble than it was worth. Okay, don't forget to build up your scene and your texture. Okay, you have to build up your entire scene. Don't just give me a couple of gears sitting on the floor that turn. Give me a whole setup where you move a lever and then the gears start to turn and then maybe the stage opens up. Call that good. That's awesome. That's 10 seconds. Okay? Think the opening of the Warren, the old opening to the Warren. Okay? Give me a fly-through of this room. Give me a fly-through of whatever it is you know you're into. And by all means, steal from the entertainment that you enjoy. Okay? Where else are you supposed to get your inspiration? So if you're into Star Wars, think about that trench scene. That took a team of artists months and months and months to make. I bet you can make it in a week if you try real hard. Okay? Questions, comments, concerns? Make sure you're including a little bit of everything that you do. If you get music from somewhere, make sure you give credit. Start and end your animations or your assignment with your animation. That way it's the very first thing I see and it's the very last thing I see. And the people on ArtStation, it's the first thing they see and it's the last thing they see. Who put the extra pictures? I think Jackie did that. She's not here. She took stills from her video and put them up on her ArtStation as well. Did you do that as well? That's a good idea. I was reading and they were like, projects that have multiple pieces of art get a lot more attention than pieces that only have one. So if you've got a couple of really good stills, put them first and then put your video down at the bottom. Okay. I want you guys to get employed. Jackie found her future on ArtStation. I think you guys can as well. All right, so if there's no questions or comments, I'm going to take another break. You guys can as well. Before you leave, make sure you come up and say, hey, this is the stuff I wrote down. Probably starting week after next or so. I'm not going to remind you to do that. It's going to be on you to do it. All right. I am done recording for the